All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of our Wolf Watch series. My name is John Mogul, and I'm Associate Director at the Wolfsonian. Tonight, we'll be discussing the legendary 1927 German expressionist film, Metropolis. We've planned this evening so that it will be of interest both for people who've already seen the movie and for those who haven't. If you've seen it, we hope this evening will give you some new insight about it or some new appreciation for it. If you haven't seen it, then maybe it will inspire you to watch it. I don't think you need to worry about plot spoilers, since plot is really not the main reason to watch this movie. Instead of plot, we're going to focus this evening on two other dimensions of Metropolis: design and music. I'm going to give a very brief introduction and then turn it over to our panelists. In preparing to give this introduction, I learned a little bit about the history of the critical reception of Metropolis. For a work that's often cited as one of the most important and influential movies ever made, people have found an awful lot to dislike about this movie, both when it first came out and in the decades since. In particular, critics, starting with H.G. Wells, have often slammed it as a poor piece of narrative science fiction and also a muddled vision of politics and class conflict. It's not a great sign when Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief of propaganda, is a big fan of your movie. In fact, the film's director, Fritz Lang, eventually pretty much disavowed it. What has made Metropolis such an indelible piece of cinema is the visual experience it provides through cinematography, special effects, and not least set design. And our first speaker tonight is going to address set design, and she's uniquely well qualified to do that. Silvia Baricione is Senior Curator at the Wolfsonian. She's curated many design exhibitions in her career, too many to mention, but most recently and most relevantly, she is the co-curator of our current exhibition, Deco Luxury to Mass Market. I was gonna say currently on view, but of course it's not on view, but it is there in the galleries, trust me. Sylvia is also a big-time cinephile. The other thing about Metropolis that has drawn a lot of attention over the decades is music. After Sylvia speaks about the design influences on Metropolis, we'll turn our attention there. When the movie premiered in Berlin in 1927, it was accompanied by an orchestral score composed by Gottfried Huppertz, which drew from different classical traditions of Germany. Since then, well over a dozen composers have been drawn to Metropolis and created their own scores. Most famously, probably Giorgio Moroder, who scored a 1984 re-release of Metropolis with pop songs featuring Freddie Mercury, Pat Benatar, and Adam Ant, among others. Tonight, we have with us Barbara Elting and James McKillop, who together make up the British-American collaborative duo known as TT and formerly known as Treasure Teeth. Among their many projects was a live performance at the Coral Gables Art Cinema in 2016 of a score that they composed for Metropolis. This evening, James and Barbara will show some clips of the movie and speak about their inspirations and the creative process that produced the music that accompanies those scenes. The two presentations together should run about a half hour total, and after that, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to write down and submit any questions or comments you have, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them this evening. So that's it from me. Sylvia, you're up.
Thank you. Good evening. I would like to talk about quickly, just looking especially at the set design, because so many people and so many critics have already talked about it. And also trying to compare some of the objects that you see in the scenes with objects in the Wilsonian collection. I will start talking about the couple, Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbour. Since then, we'll have a couple of musicians talking who did the new score for Metropolis. So we always think of Fritz Lang for Metropolis, but actually the script was written together with his wife, Thea von Harbour, who also wrote the book Metropolis. The novel, not a masterpiece. I read that it's unreadable, but anyway, so she was an important part in the creation of Metropolis. Interesting to know that Fritz Lang was trained as an architect and also had a passion for art. He collected Asian art. And so as an architect, for sure, he knew the architecture, the futuristic drawings by Sant'Elia and or Virgilio Marchi, which were made in the 1910s. And for sure, the main inspiration on him was New York. He traveled to New York in 1924, and it was the main inspiration on him for the set of Metropolis. And it was New York was also the inspiration on many other artists, among them Julius Klinger, who created this poster, which is a composition between the old architecture of Vienna and the emergence of the skyscrapers. So we have seen and we remember the incredible sets of Metropolis, and we can see how they inspired different designers, graphic designers. For example, this was a box, a game to build building prototypes, and obviously in the 1920s and 30s, many artists and architects were inspired by this utopian vision of Metropolis. But so many references are in the movie that we just can mention some of them. First, the Tower of Babel, that Maria in the tells the story of Babel, and it's obviously inspired by the famous painting by Bruegel. But what is interesting is that the main building, which is the iconic building of Metropolis, is a kind of new Tower of Babel, which was inspired by a building, an exhibition hall for an industrial fair done in Posen, which was Germany at the time, now Poznań, and designed by one of the main German expressionist architects, Hans Pölzig. So the references can be found directly, for example, in the stadium scene, which is in the beginning. This is a scene which for sure inspired Leni Riefenstahl in the 1930s, for example, in the Triumph of the Wheel. And we can find the correspondent building in Düsseldorf by Wilhelm Kreis. And for sure, Fritz Lang looked at the architecture in general, expressionist architecture in Germany, in particular Fritz Höger. And if you look at also at some of the elements like the zigzag arches, they are an element which was used also in Art Deco architecture. This is one of the interiors, and you can see a typical zigzag deco element. That was really one of the decorative motifs common in international deco. But all this incredible architecture, futurist architecture, was just a series of models made out of plywood and cardboard by a team of our productors, all of them educated in schools for applied arts, and Karl Vollbrecht in particular was the carpenter. And so you can see like how like the tricky sides of Metropolis. Even for the costumes and the scenes, there is an influence, in particular deco. This is the one of the first scenes, these eternal gardens, where we have this Arcadian scene that looks at the 18th century, and it is typical of Art Deco, just to reference to the 18th century and to modernize it with new elements like these stylized flowers that Brunelleschi designed on the costumes of the figures that he represented in Paris in the 1920s, always looking back to the 18th century, sorry. The scene of the dance in Metropolis, the doppelganger of Maria, is this very sensual dance, and it opens with this scene, her emerging from a pod-like structure, and definitely these geometric motifs remind us of Deco wrought iron motifs. And again, the figure with this particular headgear as a definitely an Art Deco style. A picture of the backstage where we can see all the main actors with Fritz Lang, and an interior of Fritz Lang bedroom. We can see how he had a modernist style using tubular furniture, and the photograph of Brigitte Helm, the main actress, wearing an Art Deco dress, definitely Art Deco dress. For the interiors, for sure, the Frederiksen, the creator of Metropolis office, shows Art Deco elements, starting from the two chairs, and again, these motifs on the floor, but also the two lamps on the sides. With the use of cones, they really are elements that you can find in lamps and lights of the period. These are two English lamps and heaters from the Wolsoniana in Genoa. And this is a famous lamp designed by Saarinen and von Nessen. The use of the cone, which was a decorative element, but also functional. Interesting, in Rothwang's office, the bad guy, the villain, the lamp, his desk lamp, reminds of the monument to the Third International by Tatlin. And there are also references to surrealism in the scene where you see the eyes, typical element that will return in Buñuel, and we can find it used in a propaganda poster for the United States in World War II. Well, the factory, naturally, the iconography of the factory will become very popular in the 1920s and 30s, but it's interesting how is like as an oniric vision also in the movie, the transformation of the factory in the Moloch, for sure inspired by the famous gardens of Bomarzo near Rome, a creation from the 17th century. The factory is also the place where workers are tortured, and in a way crucified, like in this figure crucified at the against the clock, and the clock as elements in the lettering. You see it's a 10 hours clock for the time that the workers have their shift, and you can see the lettering returns in a deco clock in the Wilsonian collection. We'll finish with the motif of the robot, the Maschinenmensch, that is something that will inspire many artists in the 1930s, starting from our iconic statue of the wrestler at the Wilsonian, and ending up with the representation of the dictator Mussolini as a robot, as the great helmsman that is breaking the chains of the sanctions against Italy. So thank you. I think we can talk about like the score of the music now.
Sylvia, Treasure Keith, we're ready for you.
Great. Do you want to start? Yeah, sure. So, first and foremost, we're James and Barbara. My name is James, that's Barbara. Yeah. I'm a native Miamian, and Barbara here is from London. Yeah. And we've been composing music together, individually and together for
10 years.
Yeah, better part of the last decade. We've started the project in London, actually, and since then have kind of hopped around the world. We're currently based in New York, but for a good amount of time we were living in Miami.
Right.
When a dear friend of ours, Dave Rodriguez, from the organization Miami Music Club, reached out to us and essentially commissioned us to perform a live score to this movie, Metropolis, at the Coral Gables Art Cinema back in 2016.
Yeah.
And
so I guess we spent close to 3 months composing this score, and we performed it live to the projected film. You know, we were right up close to it, and it was a great experience. I believe it sold out, which was great too for everyone. And yeah,
we can actually pull up a little clip from the show.
Yeah, we're gonna pull up a clip. We're gonna share our screen.
Hold on, Sylvia's still sharing the screen, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Just a moment. Sorry, everyone.
Okay, now I think we can do that.
Just one moment.
Stop to.
Okay, here's the first clip.
Is that right? Share. Okay.
Should be seeing.
Cool. Yeah, you should be seeing the first clip. We're gonna play. We just showed you essentially a clip from the performance that we did. We thought we'd start there. You can see we've got a bunch of equipment on the table. It's not the clearest video, but yeah, so we worked with a lot of hardware equipment, software. We had our laptop there. We had samplers. We had this MS-20 Mini.
Yeah, that's another thing. We're both trained in classical. We have a classical background in music.
Right.
I'm playing acoustic instruments. I'm a pianist. Barbara's a violist. But beyond that, we also experiment quite a bit with the electronic manipulation of acoustic sounds and with electronic sounds as well.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, right here behind me, we have the MS-20, which was a synthesizer we used at the performance we just viewed. And some of the patches it's actually created for it. Electronic instruments such as this allow you, in a very small form factor, to create very big and powerful environments sonically. So we kind of went with a majoritively electronic sound for the score, especially considering the subject matter of the piece.
Yeah, I brought my viola and I did do some singing as well, live with effects and whatnot. But yeah, so we spent a few months creating the composition, and so it was mostly like 60-40. 60% was prepared prior, and then there was like 40% for live work, like improvisations on top of essentially a skeleton of music. That's what worked best for us. And yeah, so that was a clip of that.
Yeah.
And I guess we're going to show you a few more clips. The next one, for some context, is the intro to Metropolis. So
just a moment.
No, you just need to click on that. The tab. Uh-oh. 1 second. I think we closed our screen.
Drag it over.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, yes. So next tab is this. Just realised we muted ourselves. So in that clip, you see the intro, the text, Metropolis and the city, the product, and then with some, kind of beautiful open-ended sounds, ambient almost, and then immediately go into the underbelly, the workers' environment, and there you can hear a lot of like mechanical, metallic,
Right, so even from the first scene of the
industrial.
film, you kind of can understand the entire microcosm of how the world works in Metropolis in a way.
Right.
And through the score, particularly with that first scene of those workers and the shift change, it basically has a bit of a nightmarish quality to it, as you can see, so we kind of tried our best to convey that through the score.
I think we also used the MS-20, this instrument.
And we used it throughout.
Yeah, pretty much, right. But, that was just the intro clip. Thought that would give a good idea of.
Yeah, to kind of come up with this like nightmarish environment, predominantly, created by the use of mechanical and rhythmic sounds and machines turning, and just kind of trying to convey that feeling.
Tensions.
Yeah.
So that's that, and I guess we'll move on to the next clip.
Yeah, we have another clip.
Yeah, we have a few more. Yeah.
This particular segment of the film is after the protagonist kind of has his awakening. He's had a bit of a privileged life where he never really understood the pain and toil that really goes into making Metropolis what it is. And after seeing that, he comes to his father and asks him, is this right? Should we be doing this? And in this moment, it's just such a particularly kind of stale corporate environment. So you notice the repeating sound of the clock in the background, which is being progressively more and less processed by digital effects as the time goes on. Kind of like has like this, rhythmic connection. It's like the clock.
Mm-hmm. And it's very bleak as well. Feeling there's noise in there, and a lot of, I guess, use of dynamics to try to convey. We try to do that generally, but when working with a film, especially black and white, it's just trying to emphasize those aspects, with quiet and loud. But
we'll go ahead and show another clip now. And this clip is actually a bit interesting. Let's go ahead and watch it first. So this clip is particularly interesting. At this point, the protagonist is kind of returning to the depths and just struggling to do whatever he can to try to alleviate the suffering of his father's workers. This way through, helping this man operating this complex machine. I will say, in our writing process, we tried to steer away from doing any sort of sounds that are too literal, too specific to a moment on the screen. There is no way to ever perfectly synchronize anything during the performance anyway, so it's better to kind of let happy little accidents fall into place in terms of placing sounds within a cinema score. Yeah. But for this piece in particular, we actually did do a little bit of kind of cutting it to the actual frame by frame, where with this particular clock here, we had the idea of using the two arms on the clock to represent the circle of fifths, which, if you're familiar at all with music, is a spherical representation of all of the different keys and how they relate to each other, and it's kind of like building block of harmony, at least within Western music.
Right.
So using that, we actually looked at the positions of the arms on this machine and used those to kind of generate the chord progressions, which is an obviously completely non-linear way in terms of standard Western music, which produced some pretty unusual and interesting harmonies. They're sounding a little bit kind of like Coltrane changes, which is another type of musical theory that was made popular by John Coltrane. But anyway, we can go on for a while about music theory and things like this. So let's talk about the next
enjoy doing
clip.
stuff like that generally.
Yeah.
Okay, next clip.
Oh, sorry about that, we were muted. And there was that. To talk a little bit about this scene, so this is the moment where the protagonist of the film wanders into what is essentially like a little religious ceremony being held underground by Maria, who is kind of like a saint-like figure in the slums of Metropolis, and here they're kind of like, talking about their hopelessness, waiting for a mediator to come to kind of like bridge the gap between the working class and the higher class of Metropolis and bring them all together. Surprise, surprise, that could be there.
Right.
But this was an interesting point in the film for us as well, because, being such a loaded film, Metropolis having so much history, so much musical history in particular, we did our very best to kind of stay away and not listen to as much of what had been done already.
Generally throughout, we kept it quite autonomous and didn't refer too much to external sources.
Or other musicians generally.
However, for this particular bit, we did refer to a medieval composer, Guillaume de Machaut, he was like an Ars Nova composer, which was a deviation from Ars Antiqua. I think I said that right. But anyway, so he kind of like developed this new, more forward-looking medieval music, if there is forward-looking medieval music. But anyway, so what we did was this beautiful piece. I forget what the name was, but we put it in Ableton, and we got Ableton to recognize, to basically translate the music into notes for us to work with.
Right, Ableton Live is the software we use to compose and perform with, and using that we were able to take some of the score from this particular piece by Michel and manipulate it, kind of remix it in a way, and then perform it back, not through vocals, but through synthesizers and with effects, creating like kind of like beautiful pastoral piece.
But also kind of broken.
Yeah, also featuring some like, chopped clips of the original recording.
Right, at the end. You can hear
well.
the vocals at the end.
Yeah, so this is one of the moments in the film where we did kind of look to outside sources, where aside from that, we kind of tried to keep it within our own imaginations and our own interpretation.
Yeah. And I guess we just have one more final clip to talk about, so we'll go ahead and do that.
Well, we have to share again.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Do it again. Share. Okay, here we go. We're not muted. Okay. So this is another example of the MS-20 where we created this loop, arpeggiated almost loop of central pure like waveform, ongoing, and we tried to create this sense of almost, you know, that feeling when you hear a loud explosion and then that kind of after effect, like audible, like mute you get in your ears, you're desensitized, like it's yeah. So we wanted to experiment with trying to portray that feeling. Like,
right.
You just heard a large explosion, things are kind of filtered in a way. So
yeah, to talk about this particular piece of the film, this is at a point where the workers are revolting, machines below Metropolis are exploding left and right, floods are happening.
Yeah.
This happens for a very long portion of this film towards the end. So it was interesting trying to convey like such a sense of urgency and explosions going around without literally trying to have explosions going around everywhere.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And you know, urgency, pushing forward and moving it on into the next, you know, composition.
Absolutely. I mean, that's another thing to kind of touch upon as well. It's just the idea of this particularly being a silent film, like no sound whatsoever. We had a little bit of a unique position in composing a score for it, and that we could include like a little bit of like Foley sounds, or kind of like do more of a sound design as well as the, actual music per se. Right. We definitely use some techniques to maybe add that element in there, you know. Right. Totally. But yeah, I mean, is there anything else? That's our last clip. I mean, in conclusion, working on this score was something that was a tremendous amount of work, but we found tremendously rewarding in the end. You know, again, we performed this to a full house in Miami back in 2016, and it was just such a lovely experience, a unique experience to be in a cinema and be performing and seeing all of these people reacting to this film. With a great sound systems. Yeah, you know, Miami Music Club had a great PA system, and so it was really loud, in a good way, out there. Yeah, it was quite loud. A beautiful, transcendent experience. Yeah, okay. I think we're good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James and Barbara, and thank you also, Sylvia, for those great presentations. We do have some time for questions and discussion. Again, I invite you, if you have questions or you just have comments, to use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions. I will just start out with a question that I think can be addressed to both to Sylvia and to James and Barbara. One of the things about Metropolis, and there's some evidence of that in the clips that you've shown, is that even though there's nothing explicitly Christian in the movie, there's a fair amount of kind of implicit Christian symbolism. And I want to ask, we'll start with Sylvia, how is that sort of quasi-Christian message expressed in the set designs and other visual elements? And then moving on to Barbara and James, you mentioned the medieval composer, but how may that have influenced some of the music that you made for this? But why don't we begin with Sylvia on that?
Well, I would say that the Christian symbols are quite explicit from the cathedral to all the biblical references. And I think that they come mostly from Thea, because I read that her book was saturated with Christian motifs. So I think that Fritz balanced that a bit. But it's very interesting, this also contrast between Gothic, the Gothic cathedral, and the modernity of the city. They didn't mention the Gothic cathedral architecture because, I mean, it seemed obvious as a reference.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on our end,
I mean, sacred music has always been an interest of ours, choir, choral music in general. Something I grew up doing quite a bit. Compositional-wise, you know, when you're thinking about these almost meditative environments or environments where people pray or try to get some kind of religious experience, you know, there's often correlation to choral and vocal music. So that was our initial response for referring back to that composer.
Yeah, I mean, music and religion have been so intrinsically connected throughout history that it's almost impossible to talk about one without the other.
And I do love a lot of religious music, even though I'm not particularly religious.
So one thing about this movie, like many other silent films of the time, is that there's some very long takes, almost excruciatingly long, of people's faces or people just looking at each other. Mm-hmm. And there are parts of the film where there's action or where there's very dramatic visual elements, and it seems sort of natural for the music to be responding to those things. I'm just wondering how you compose music for those moments where nothing is happening except perhaps you're looking at someone's face or you're looking at two people looking at each other.
Well, yeah, that was definitely quite the challenge. And I will say that, you know, one way we went about trying to like circumvent that was just trying to like kind of like, in a way, distance ourselves from the narrative and just kind of put ourselves in a position where we just are kind of like feeling like the mood of the scene. Right. Like even, you know, because there's so much going on. And this is such a long movie. And another point we haven't mentioned yet, you know, this is an almost 3-hour-long movie, and we performed the whole score live with no bathroom breaks. You know, I was going to say that, it was an interesting challenge, but we tried our best to go for a mood.
Yeah, it's like a mood making, ambiance,
in those circumstances.
Feeling. And there are examples of that certainly throughout, where it's just a lot of drones, singular noises.
Yeah.
Some sparse, you know, a lot of silence too sometimes.
Yeah,
so using silence.
We don't have a clip of it, but for like say the scene of Rob Lang's house from the exterior, it's just trying to create like, you know, a bit back to sound design, like I was talking about, just trying to create environments for certain scenes, not necessarily music per se, but that's arguable, but you know, just very moody and.
So a question for Sylvia. You talked and you showed how the film was influenced by a variety of different design movements that were active in the 1920s, and that Fritz Lang and the crew of the film would have been aware of. Could you talk at all about whether a kind of influence in the other direction, whether the film itself had an influence on the built environment or on design in later years and decades?
Well, for sure. I mean, I just showed an architectural drawing from the one from by Van Doren. But yes, if you think also of the photographs of like how this interest in this kind of architecture, the spectacular architecture of New York was for sure influenced also by Metropolis. But also thinking of like the machine, like this. Well, we know that the aesthetic of the machine. I don't know if Metropolis contributed somehow, because when you look inside the factory, just thinking of the shape of the shapes of the lamps that I just showed, they really like a reference to motifs of the machine. So I think it's very influential. It has been influential for sure. And also, I mean, we know of other movies from Brazil to Blade Runner, more recently.
I'm going to share my screen for a moment to show one additional influence from the movie, and that is Janelle Monae. For those of you who enjoy her music, has been throughout her career influenced not only by science fiction and Afrofuturism, but this movie in particular. And although this, I apologize, this isn't a very good image, but if you see in particular that sort of central structure on her headpiece, it's pretty clearly, I think, a quote of the Tower of Babel in the film. There were a couple questions in the Q&A that I want to get to, so let me stop sharing. So, a question from Jeff: why was the film such a failure at the box office? I believed it caused Germany's largest film company's bankruptcy, which, although I'm not an expert on the film, I believe that that's true. I know that Fritz Lang spared no expense in producing the film, that many of the special effects were pioneering and extremely difficult to reproduce. In fact, extremely difficult on the crew and on the actors themselves. I don't know why it was such a failure. As I said at the beginning, it received pretty mixed reviews on release. I think people were sort of stunned by the visual quality, but also left a little bit nonplussed by the message and by the plot. But of course, critical reception is not always the same as box office success and failure. So I don't know exactly what the story was there. I don't know whether Sylvia or James and Barbara, you have more on that.
I can't particularly state as to why it was such a failure, but I will know that Fritz definitely dealt with it in a way that he thought, okay, maybe I just have to re-edit the film. And I know that there were several re-edits to the film where he tried to shorten it down, he tried to condense it and simplify it. And if you'll notice while watching, I'm not sure if the film, how many people have seen the entire film, but there are several scenes that have had to be restored because they were originally cut from the film. And then later those cuts to be restored, the film had started deteriorating and it was in a very bad condition from not being kept properly. So the most recent restorations where you see the film in its entirety is the original edit before all of Fritz Lang's re-edits to try to address the fact that so many people were having trouble with the film.
It was quite a detective story to find the lost footage and to reassemble it in a way that matched the Lang's original version. Sylvia, I know that you
I wanted to say that actually, I think it was not successful in Germany, but quite successful in Europe. I read that in France, Italy was successful. I don't understand why not in Germany. I mean, it was it was period of crisis. I mean, it was the Republic of Weimar, but I don't know. And also, So yeah, I don't know the reason.
I know
You can say
that
it stood the test of time.
the German studios deal with the American distributor, I forget which film company it was, stated that the US company had the right to edit it and cut it as they wanted. And they decided that for the US market, this 2.5 hour long film was not going to go over well. And they really, really dramatically cut it to about, I think, 1.5 hours. So really about 1/3 of the film was lost or was cut from the American release, and much of that material was lost for many decades. Sylvia, you told me, I think in 2010, a collection in Buenos Aires discovered that they had almost a complete cut, although the quality of some of those scenes was very low, I think.
But also the version by Giorgio Moroder, which was 1984, it was just 80-something minutes, no? It was a shorter version.
Yeah, it was quite short.
And, yeah, and it was very successful, maybe also for that reason.
Okay, well, I think that we have approached the end of our time. I had one question about from someone who came in late and asked whether they could catch the whole thing. This is recorded, and we can make this available if you'd like to see the full presentation, and we'll figure out how to do that and how to make that available. And I just wanted to read a message from Kevin, wanted to send congrats to you all for a great presentation. And likewise from me, Sylvia, James, and Barbara, thank you very much. And everybody have a good evening.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.